Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Please.
Stephanie Street, Terry Garner, Dr. Clarence G. Newsom, and President Clinton.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Clinton Presidential Center. We're very thrilled that you have joined us this evening for a very special evening where we're celebrating the center's two temporary exhibits, Mandela, The Journey to Ubuntu, and Art of Africa, One Continent, Limitless Vision. These companion exhibits are as visually compelling as they are inspirational, and I hope you'll enjoy them as much as we have. Before we begin our program, I'd like to recognize some of our distinguished guests. First and foremost, I understand we have some members of the Little Rock Nine with us tonight, and we're very honored to have you here. If you could raise your hand, wave to us, we'll give you a great big hand. I believe we also have our former director of FEMA, Mr. James Lee Witt, and Janie are here with us this evening. I believe I spotted the dean of the Clinton School, Skip Rutherford, here. Next, I'd like to thank our generous sponsors who have made these exhibits and tonight's reception possible. The Art of Africa and Mandela exhibit sponsors are Roadrunner and Garcia Hamilton Associates. Our opening reception sponsors are Dr. Anthony Fletcher and Dr. Joe Hargrove, Custom Advertising of Arkansas, Denise and Hershey Garner, and Mays Bird Associates. And please look to the screen here where you can see our terrific host committee. Let's give a round of applause to all of our generous sponsors. It's my pleasure to recognize two of our speakers tonight and introduce a third. Dr. Clarence G. Newsom recently served as the president of the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in Cincinnati from 2003 until 2017. He now serves on its board of directors and currently served as a member of the board of trustees of his alma mater, Duke University. Welcome, Dr. Newsom, to Little Rock and to the Clinton Center. And of course, my boss, President Bill Clinton, a dedicated public servant, an innovator, an avid Razorback fan, a doting grandfather of two, and as we like to refer to him here at the Clinton Center, our Clinton Center curator-in-chief. Now, most of our temporary exhibits are inspired by President Clinton's interest, and we sure are lucky that he has a lot of them. He is a subject matter expert on pretty much everything from Elvis to ants, termites, beets, and spiders, which were the subjects of our last temporary exhibit, Extreme Bugs, and so much more. Our current temporary exhibit, Mandela, is the direct result of President Clinton's engagement. About a year ago, he received a letter from the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center urging him to consider hosting this extraordinary exhibit at his presidential center. Well, President Clinton was intrigued and asked us to look into it, and, well, here we are. It's now my pleasure to introduce my good friend Terry Garner, the director of the Clinton Library. Terry is going to tell us a little bit about our companion exhibit, The Art of Africa. It is an extraordinary collection of objects that were given to the Clintons during the presidency, and it also includes some of President Clinton's favorite items from his personal collection. Terry.
Thank you, Stephanie. And as director of this library, I take great pride in our preservation work of the Clinton administration's gifts. It's a large collection, the largest by far in all or any of the presidential libraries. As a matter of fact, it is larger than the first 10 presidential libraries combined. You have a lot of stuff. It's a collection that's a cultural statement that all that happened in the 1990s. The people loved their president, and they thought of him as one of their family. And sometimes, maybe a little too much, they thought of him as one of his family. One of our favorite parts of the collection is a family from Illinois decided to send President Clinton pictures of them enjoying sandwiches. And they did. We have 25 to 30 pictures of a very happy family eating a very large sandwich. We also have many important mementos of each and every family. I mean, some of the very personal things they sent to him. And every time President Clinton went for a jog, running shoes, baseball hats, and T-shirts would appear to the White House in the number of hundreds. And we have them all. Every pair of tennis shoes are down there being preserved and monitored, shall we say. They sent paintings, sculptures, books, jewelry. They literally sent it all. Since the president and the secretary visited and was visited by many leaders of various countries, the head of state gifts are numerous and absolutely fabulous. But the African gifts have always been the heart and soul of this collection. Along with the head of state gifts, the gifts from the African people will move you and will fill you with awe. Stephanie and I have wanted to present these gifts to you for a very long time. And when the Mandela exhibit was made available, we knew it was the time. The Art of Africa will explore the colors, shapes, and textures of Africa through the Presidential Library gifts and some of President Clinton's personal collection. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Clarence Newsome. Dr. Newsome is a triple alumnus of Duke University, receiving a BA in Religious Studies in 1972, a Master in Divinity in 1975, and a PhD in American Religious History in 1982. While an undergraduate, he lettered in football and was the first African American scholarship athlete to graduate from Duke. In addition, he was on the Atlantic Coast Conference Honor Roll for outstanding academic achievement during athletic participation in ACC. Dr. Newsome currently serves as a member of the Duke University Board of Trustees. He is a past president of Shaw University, and he previously served as Dean of the School of Divinity at Howard University and as a member of the Duke Divinity School faculty. He is known for his academic work in African American history and culture, as well as religious history. Dr. Newsome oversaw the creation of a museum of religious art at Howard, acquiring more than $2.7 million in church artifacts and icons with support from the Smithsonian Institute. He has also served on several major committees of the Association of Theological Schools in the United States and Canada, and is a member and past president of the Society for Study of Black Religion, a nationwide think tank of scholars engaged in studying the religious experience of African Americans. Please join me in a warm welcome to Dr. Clarence Newsom.
Thank you, Terry. That's much more of an introduction than I had anticipated, so I had to regroup. But thank you again, and good evening to everyone. I'm so delighted to be with you. As the former president of the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center, and now a member of its board of directors, it's an honor to be here with each of you and share in the opening celebration of Mandela, the journey to Ubuntu. At the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center, we reveal stories of freedom's heroes, from the era of the Underground Railroad to contemporary times, challenging and inspiring everyone to take courageous steps for freedom today. As a museum of conscience, as an education center, convener of dialogue and activation space dedicated to inclusive freedom, where all people everywhere enjoy rights and privileges of equal number, equal quality, and equal kind. We not only reveal stories of freedom's heroes, we make a point to celebrate and lift up contemporary freedom heroes as well. One of those heroes is in this room. Another is the focus of the exhibition we previewed this evening. In 1998, before even opening its doors to the public, the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center created the International Freedom Conductor Award, our most prestigious award, to recognize the contributions of contemporary individuals who, by their actions and personal examples, reflect the spirit and courageous actions of conductors on the Underground Railroad. We underscore the importance of this award by offering a $25,000 stipend, or however you might characterize it. Since bestowing the first International Freedom Conductor Award to Rosa Parks, we have honored freedom heroes from different walks of life who all made a positive impact on contemporary freedom issues. President Bill Clinton received the International Freedom Conductor Award in June 2007, along with President George H.W. Bush, for their unprecedented collaboration in raising donations worldwide for victims of the Southeast Asia tsunami and Hurricane Katrina in Louisiana and Mississippi. Nelson Mandela was honored with the International Freedom Conductor Award posthumously in August 2014. His great-grandson, Luvuyo, came over to receive the award. You better keep your eyes on this young man. He's of the manor born. The legacy of South Africa's first democratically elected president, an anti-apartheid revolutionary who was known for cooperating with the leaders who had oppressed his people in an effort to help bring racial reconciliation and justice to his homeland and an eventual peaceful transition to democracy, is a story from which we can all well learn. Mandela, the Journey to Ubuntu, provides a platform for a sharing of values so richly present in Mandela's life to understand the role that forgiveness, leadership, truth, and sacrifice play in overcoming the challenges we face in society today. As I mentioned before, it's an honor to be here with you on this stage and in this wonderful presidential center, my first time. with colleagues Jesse Kramer. Raise your hand, Jesse. I want people to recognize you. He is the designer, and we did it without breaking the World Bank, as I said earlier. And Ms. Jamie Glavick, our Vice President for Communications, would you raise your hand? In his absence, I want to recognize Mr. Matthew Wellman, the photographer, the commission photographer for the Nelson Mandela Foundation in South Africa. There are some rich stories to be told with each of those photographs, and we are in great debt to Matthew for sharing them with us through his photographic work as well as his narrative. In either case, these people who worked so diligently on this exhibition with our entire team in Cincinnati and bringing Mandela's story to life in a new way. At this time, I have the great pleasure to introduce a man who needs no introduction here and welcome him to the podium as we honor two great contemporaries, their friendship and vision for a better future for all. Please join me in welcoming President Bill Clinton.
Thank you. Wow. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. First, thank you all for being here. I want to thank Stephanie and Terry Garner and all those in our group who were responsible for these two exhibits. Thank you, James Lee Witt and Janie, for being here. Secretary Rodney Slater, thank you for being here. Thanks to the Little Rock 9 members who are here tonight. Just think, tomorrow we're going to celebrate the 60th anniversary of the Little Rock 9, and because of the current state of affairs, they're probably more relevant today than they have been in 60 years. They'd probably just as soon that not be true, but it is. So no matter how old you are, you got to keep your suit on and your running shoes on, and you got to keep going. I want to thank the Clinton School students and faculty who are here, and thank you to the sponsors who made this possible. I have to mention one just because it opens the story of why we're here about Africa. One of the sponsors is Richard Mays. When I was governor, I appointed Richard Mays to the Arkansas Supreme Court. He was the first African American to serve and the youngest justice ever appointed. Long toward the end of the year, I was around the court, and there was a lady who had worked there for decades. Little white-haired lady who came up to me and she said, "You know, Governor, when you appointed Judge Mays, I just didn't know about that." And I looked at her and I said, "And?" She said, "And I believe he's the smartest person on the Supreme Court." Thank you very much for doing it. And I'm telling you that to make the real point of these exhibits. The real point of the Underground Railroad Museum, which I helped to dedicate in Cincinnati. And that is, when you see other people as people, it then becomes impossible to treat them as categories and to dehumanize them and to seek short-term advantage at the cost of long-term harm to other people. And that is a very big deal. The Underground Railroad is in Ohio, but it ran all the way up through New York into Canada. When we celebrated the millennium in 2000, in my last year as president, Hillary made sure we protected some of the sites on the Underground Railroad. Also, coincidentally, in the same part of New York that was the birthplace of the right of women to vote. They all had stories. And as they became real and people to others, things were different. You mentioned that you honored me in the first President Bush. It is worth noting in this era when people seem to want credit for knocking eligible voters off the voting rolls, that George H.W. Bush, when a congressman, a Republican congressman from Texas, when it would have been popular to vote otherwise, voted for the Open Housing Act. It is worth noting that his son, when he became president, supported immigration reform, and I publicly supported him. And that in his last year as president, the United States Congress overwhelmingly, the Senate 98-0, voted to extend the Voting Rights Act, which was then gutted by the Supreme Court, unleashing the most voracious efforts to restrict the right to vote since the Jim Crow era. George W. Bush and I have become unlikely friends because, to put it charitably, he did not like me. And I once told him, I said, I don't blame it. I said, I don't care. You love your father, I won. You hate my guts, it's fine. And we disagree on just about everything. But you're not afraid of people who are different from you, and I like that. You would be happy to go with me to South Texas and debate immigration, trade, any other kind of policy before people and trust the voters to make up their mind. You somehow see people as people. And to me, that's the most important thing. And I say that because the African Americans mostly came here from Africa. Some came by stopping in Haiti. Some came by stopping at other places in the Caribbean. They are the legacy of our greatest sin, and they offer us our greatest promise to redeem the real meaning of what it means to be an American. You can see it in the job we have ahead of us to help the people of Houston and the Gulf Coast recover from Harvey, to help the people of Florida recover from Irma, and to help our friends in the Caribbean and the American Virgin Islands, most of whom are African Americans, and in Puerto Rico, most of whom are Hispanic Americans, who are devastated by this. Are they less Americans because of the color of their skin or the nature of how they got here? I don't think so. And so we will see in the days and weeks and months ahead whether we do what we should do. Not to mention our other neighbors in the Caribbean. Some of those little islands have literally been wiped off the map. People who've lived there, their families for a couple of hundred years, have literally nothing left. So we are now called upon, in the aftermath of that terrible financial crash in 2008 and the rise of ethnic nationalism all over the world, to revisit the history of our relationship to Africa and the relationship of what has happened and what is happening there to what is happening here. So this is really important. I want to thank one other person, the Mandela Foundation's photographer, Matthew Willman, who's not here tonight, who provided a lot of the photographs you will see there. And I want to talk a little about the Africa exhibit first, and then about Mandela. In the last 16 years I've been at the Clinton Foundation, I've been to Africa more than 10 times. I can't quite establish how many, but to South Africa 10 times, and I tried to go every year around the time of Mandela's birthday as long as I could, except for once when they asked me to stay in New York and raise money for his foundation. I've done things I'll never forget. We have 155,000 small farmers that we support in doubling, tripling, quadrupling, sometimes quintupling their incomes. Africa has the largest amount of arable farmland in the world. The potential for 30, maybe 40 million more people to farm the land, feed their own people, help feed the rest of the world. And believe me, it won't hurt Arkansas farmers because we're soon going to have 8.5 or 9 billion people on planet Earth, and it's going to be a challenge for us all to work together to feed them. So when you see all this, remember that as far as we can tell, human beings first arose on the planet in East Africa somewhere between 150 and 200,000 years ago. And it took them until about 90,000 years ago to get out of Africa. They began to wander across the land bridges into Europe and what is now the Middle East. 40 or 50,000 years ago, they had made boats and began to go to Australia and other places. The indigenous people of Australia are out of Africa, but 40 or 50,000 years ago. We now know that unless you're 100% descendant from sub-Saharan Africa, which is almost nobody, almost no African Americans, almost no Africans anymore. Your human makeup, as measured by your genome content, is about 99.5% the same. And we know if your people ever came through Europe, 3 or 4% of your genome is Neanderthal. Now, when I told Hillary that, she was not surprised to find out that I was part Neanderthal. She was, however, stunned to find out that she was too. And I say that because almost everything we read today has to do with the all-encompassing, non-rational, passionate elevation of differences that are rooted in 0.5% of our genome. We spend 99.5% of our time thinking about that. And if we're lucky, 0.5% of our time thinking about what we have in common. So when you see this African art, and when you read about or look at the pictures that demonstrate Nelson Mandela's leadership from prison, from his house arrest, as president, and afterward, remember, we're not as different as we like to think. I am very proud of the art upstairs. Some of it comes from here in our collection. A few of the pieces I donated from my office. I have a few more at home that include some reasonably rare African masks. I'm going to get down here, and I apologize they're not here tonight. But the whole thing, both the exhibits, are designed to make us think about what we owe to Africa, what we did to Africa, what they've done for us, and what are we going to do now? I have in my yard something I couldn't figure out how to get out and get down here, but it's a massive carved bird that I got in South Africa that is a symbol of good luck. And I leave it in the backyard, and I look at it when it's raining. I have any number of pieces. I have a very tall giraffe that I got down there that's in my backyard that I look at through the trees and lift my head and wonder how the giraffes are doing. Chelsea and I have done a lot of work, and Hillary did as Secretary of State, to try to save the African elephants, which are endangered. We have visited in northern Kenya one of the great elephant preserves in the world, run by an 82-year-old white Kenyan named Ian Baker Hamilton, with his wife, his daughter, and many young people, all Africans. There are 900 elephants there, and one young African knows 500 of them by name. When you see them keening and crying over the loss of their children, it's hard to imagine why we would do nothing to prevent the destruction for a relatively modest amount of money of the elephants just to get their tusks. All of these I want you to think about. Now to Mandela. We all generally know he was a great man who was confined for 27 years and came out, and instead of being hateful, he invited his jailers to his inauguration, and even more important, he put the leaders of the political parties who kept him in prison for 27 years in his cabinet. He lived by the spirit of what is in the Zulu language called Ubuntu. It means in English, I am because you are. That is, we like to think we exist separate from others, but we don't. The meaning of life is in relationship to others. And Mandela embodied this philosophy in a lot of different ways. I first met him in 1992, but I first saw him whole in 1990 when he was released from prison. It was an early Sunday morning in Little Rock, I'll never forget it. And Hillary and I got Chelsea up. She was not quite 10 years old. And we took her down to the kitchen in the governor's mansion, and we sat her on the counter, and we had a little television up above the whatever that is that holds the bread and all that stuff. And we turned it on, and I said, Chelsea, you got to watch this. This may be the most important thing you ever see. Nelson Mandela is walking free. And it was all carefully organized. By then, he'd been living under house arrest for about 11 years, and he'd befriended all of his guards. And we saw him walk up a long road to the gate that was locked, get in a car, and ride out. It was breathtaking. And it made a lasting impression on my daughter. I'll come back to that. Fast forward to 1992. In 1992, the then mayor of New York City, David Dinkins, who was a longtime supporter of Mandela, brought him to our suite at the Democratic National Convention, where I was about to be nominated. And he immediately impressed me. First of all, he didn't act like a politician. The first thing he did was sit and talk to Hillary and talk to Chelsea, find out about their lives, what they were doing, how they were going to adjust if I won the election, all that sort of stuff. And we became friends, then I won. And we worked closely together for the 5 years he served after he won in 1994. in the first election encompassing all South Africans in 300 years. So since he was older than me, I said, I'll show you great respect. I like to work late. So whenever we have a lot of business to do, they were trying to dismantle their nuclear weapons. They were trying to do all kinds of stuff that we needed to work with them on. So he would typically call me about 10:30 at night because it was convenient for him. It was in the morning in South Africa. He never called once, and we had a lot of conversations. And some of them were pretty heated because we had differences over certain issues that never affected either our friendship or my respect for him, but he had a different job and he had to advance the interests of his country. But he never called once that he didn't first ask how Hillary was doing, how Chelsea was doing. I remember once he said, "How's Chelsea doing?" I said, "She's doing fine." He said, "Is she still awake?" I said, "Yeah, she's doing her homework." He said, "Go get her." So I went and got my daughter. I said, "Chelsea, Nelson Mandela wants to talk to you." She said, "What?" I said, "Yeah, he wants to talk to you." So he said, "Now, Chelsea, are you really doing your homework?" She said, "Remember, you're a very smart girl, but you have to develop your mind. There's no telling what you could become. Will you promise me you're going to do this?" She said, "Yes, President Mandela, I'm going to do it. I do it all the time." He said, "Well, that's very good." I saw Nelson Mandela, imagine that, given the headlines today, over and over again do these things. I saw him bring the World Rugby Cup to South Africa. Now, if you've never played rugby, that couldn't mean anything to you. But in South Africa, rugby was the ultimate white apartheid supporting Afrikaner sport. Nobody could believe they were going to bring the World Cup or that Mandela supported it. He not only supported it, he started wearing the jersey of the South African team around. And he sent word out to all the townships that he expected everybody to watch the games on television and to support the country. And unbelievably, South Africa made it to the finals and upset the finest team in the world, the New Zealand All Blacks, and won the World Cup. But he wasn't just like that in public. I have a friend who's an evangelical minister named Tony Campolo. Some of you know him. And he wanted to shake hands with Nelson Mandela when he was in South Africa, and we tried to arrange it, and the only time he could see him was in an airport. Mandela was leaving, but he said he'd be glad to meet him because he knew what a good man he was and what he'd done. So Tony got there early, and he told me he hid behind a column and watched Mandela walk into the lobby of the airport just because he wanted to see how all the wealthy South Africans, mostly white, who were in the airport, would relate to him. And he said for some reason there was a little girl there about 5 or 6 years old, blonde-haired, blue-eyed girl, who was a little bit away from her parents. So he went up to make sure she was all right, and he said, "Do you know who I am?" She said, "Yes, you're Mr. Mandela. You're our president." He said, "Well, let me tell you something. You're obviously a smart young lady, so you must study hard and do well, and maybe someday you'll be president of South Africa." Now keep in mind, this guy had just won an election against 18 opponents with 62 or 63% of the vote. But he wanted everybody to feel that they were a part of the whole, subject to equal treatment. He was determined not to return what had been directed at him. I loved working with him, although he could be a pain. He would call me. If Mandela started the conversation, "My president," that was a very bad sign. So he called me one day and he said, "My president." I said, "Okay, I know what this means." this means you're going to ask me to do something I don't want to do. I probably have no business doing it, and I'm going to agree anyway, so let's just cut out all the middle stuff. Tell me what you want me to do. And he said, well, you know, before the genocide in Rwanda, there was a genocide in Burundi, and 150,000 people were killed. And there's 21 political parties, and we're going to get 19 or 20 of them to sign off on a peace agreement in Arusha at the Peace Center in Tanzania. But he said, I need you to do that. I said, why? He said, because you're the only one that ever paid any attention to us, and so we want you to come. And he said, this time you be the good guy, I'll be the bad guy. He said, get up and give one of those, you know, look to the future talks you give and make everybody feel good, and then I'll come and hit them over the head and tell them they got to sign this deal. So I said, okay, so I went. And it happened just like he said it would. And it's like all things in politics, there are no permanent victories or defeats, but it was a pretty good thing, and it staved off another round of violence. Then after we left office, we started working together on HIV and AIDS, because even though I had tripled America's funding for AIDS, and we were giving 25% of everything the world was spending, and had recommended doubling the budget again, it was peanuts compared to the size of the problem. And at the time, there was no global fund on AIDS, TB, and malaria, and there was no PEPFAR. We got PEPFAR in another period of remarkable cooperation when the evangelical Christian community decided they had a religious obligation to try to save the lives of poor people, and no matter how they got AIDS, they deserved a chance to live once it was obvious that we had medicine that would give people a normal life. And President Bush signed what I think was his finest accomplishment, the PEPFAR bill. We got the global fund on AIDS, TB, and malaria up and running, and the rest is history. When we started working, there were only 200,000 people in poor countries getting medicine to stay alive. Today, more than 18 million have it, and more than 11 million of them got it through agreements we negotiated through our Health Access Initiative, which is now a vast independent foundation funded largely by the Gates Foundation and the British government. We don't take any money from the American government. They just announced, along with the Gates Foundation, yet another reduction in prices. We'd already cut the price of children's AIDS medicine by 90%, and more than 3/4 of the kids alive on earth get the medicine through this. All because, you know, Mandela was always gigging me to do something that I was otherwise not inclined to do. I could tell you a lot of these stories, but I think I'll tell you something that's more relevant to the current climate. We were talking one day, and I said, you know, I know you're a great man and all that, but you're a very canny politician and a very tough guy. It was good politics to invite your jailers to your inauguration. And even better, to put the leaders of the parties that opposed you in your government. But tell me the truth, when you were leaving all that imprisonment, didn't you hate them all over again? He said, oh yes. He said, you know, I really hated them for 14 years because I was so badly abused, and I didn't get to see my kids grow up, and they wound up having a lot of problems because they didn't have a father. And it ended my marriage, and I realized one day they could take everything from me except my mind and my heart. He said, those things I would have to give away, and I decided not to give them away. And it was when I was in one of my perennial tussles with the Congress, and he looked at me and smiled. He said, neither should you. And I said, okay. So you got well, but you were confined for 13 more years. So when you walked out the last time, did you hate him all over again? He was great. He was so honest. He said, absolutely. He said, I did, and I was also scared. I hadn't been free in 27 years. And he said, there I was, walking down that road, feeling all that anger. And right before I got in the car, I had this insight that if I hated them after I got in the car and drove out, I would still be their prisoner. I wanted to be free, and so I let it go. And then he said, that time he didn't have to say, and so should you. So, fast forward. One night he calls me on the phone. He said, oh, they're giving me hell. I said, who, the Afrikaners? He said, oh, no, my people. The ANC, they're just cussing me, something terrible. I said, what's the problem? He said, they say, Madiba, you just won 62% of the vote. You beat 18 people. We control everything. And you put these people who kept you in jail in your cabinet. And while you were in jail, they were beating us up and shooting us. What are you thinking? I said, what did you say? He said, I asked him, he said, you know, we just voted for the first time in 300 years. So let me ask you this. Can we run the banks all by ourselves? Can we run the military all by ourselves? Can we run the police all by ourselves? Can we regulate the stock market all by ourselves? He said, is there one thing in this country that we can do all alone? He said, maybe someday. Today is not that day. He said, I'm the one that spent 27 years in prison. If I can get over it, so can you. We got to do this together. Now, such a thing would be looked at as silly today, wouldn't it? When we're all supposed to be divided up and beating each other half to death. It's what he lived by. He lived by Ubuntu. Because we got this exhibit from the Underground Railroad Museum in Ohio, I hope you'll just indulge me one story. Because everybody has to decide, whether you're going to measure your life by what seems to be currently valuable and what seems to currently work, or whether there's something you believe that you're prepared to believe in sunshine and in storms. So I will tell you my story. A lot of African Americans, as we all know, moved to Chicago and moved to Michigan from Arkansas and moved to California. It is not generally as well known that quite a large number went to Ohio. One day in the recent election, I was taking a little trip, just stopping alongside the road, talking to people in little towns, and put out in advance I was going to come. If anybody wanted to come see me, we would. Low overhead, hopefully you get a lot of pictures, and they send them to all their friends and all that. So there's a minister standing there with a bejeweled cross in a town in eastern Ohio. I got out and shook his hand, and he said, I am Bishop Stewart. He said, let's don't waste time on politics. I'm for her. I was for it last time. It took all the heat. I voted for you twice. I had to. I said, why? He said, because for the purposes of this conversation, the most important thing is that I am the proud grandson of Luther Black of Hope, Arkansas. And I knew what he was going to say. I said, and? And he said, my grandfather called me when you were running. And he said, from just before World War II into the 1950s, he said, there was no food stamps, there was no Medicare, there was no Medicaid, there was no nothing. Every black person I knew in Hope, Arkansas worked, but a lot of them didn't get paid. There were weeks when they didn't get paid. And one day, my grandfather was in your grandfather's tiny grocery store across the street from the cemetery, and we all lived behind it on streets without concrete. And your grandfather looked at him and said, Luther, you need to feed your family and you don't have any money. He said, that's right, Mr. Cassidy, I don't. He said, anybody that's working deserves to feed their family. He said, I'm working, I just didn't get paid. He said, take whatever you need, write it in this little book, and if you can ever pay for it, come back. He said he didn't just do that for me, he did that for everybody. Now, he had more money than we had, but he didn't have any money. Nobody had any money then. He said, if he's half the man his grandfather was, he'll be a good president. You got to be for him. Now, why do I tell you that? I'd rather have a grandfather like that than a billionaire any day of the week. And the Little Rock Nine sparked my interest in Africa. How in the heck did we all get here? Hillary and I went on a delayed honeymoon to Haiti because I didn't think voodoo could be as simple as all those really horrible vampire movies, which we now see are sweeping television in different ways, right? I learned a lot about that. You will see an ancient cultures in the art of people who have done what they do in the arts for a very long time to express the reality of their lives and their religious convictions. Voodoo is actually a religion born of the Fon people in what is now Benin and used to be called Dahomey till the mid-70s. And it is, like many Native American religions, a spirit-based religion, but like the ancient Zoroastrians of what was then Persian and now we call Iran, a Manichaean religion. That is, they believe the world was created by one God. They believe good and evil exists on earth. They believe good and evil are in more or less equal balance. And they believe they manifest themselves in spirits that can inhabit bodies, and if the wrong spirit's in you, you've got to get it out. The whole zombie phenomenon was actually born of the fact that the voodoo priests had to be the social service agency, the criminal justice system, and everything else in poor areas that had no courts, no prosecutors, no lawyers, no jails. And if you did something really bad, they would sentence you to be buried for anywhere between 1 and 3 days and make you drink a potion that included the extract from a plant that contained a very dangerous poison called tetrodotoxin, which, if properly administered, would take your heartbeat so low that you might not even have a measurable pulse. And the best of the potion makers could put you under for a day, take you up, and it was terrifying because you're completely awake, you're completely aware, you just can't move. And the most severe people got 3 days. And the so-called zombies are people who got too much, not enough to kill them, but enough to do brain damage. It's as simple as that. But there are people all over Haiti and all over West Africa walking around today who have suffered these punishments, and it turned out to be very effective, and they weren't brain damaged. My point is, that's pretty sophisticated. It reminded me of a conversation I had in a rainforest with an Aboriginal leader in Australia once who showed me some beans. He said, we love these berries, and we eat them all the time, but they have to be washed in the river for 2 full days before they're not poisoned. And he said, I have often wondered how many generations of people died before we became smart chemists. Why are you laughing about this? I mean, I'm laughing, it's funny. But it also shows you that's a very sophisticated thing. You're sitting there trying to hold a society together. You don't have courts, you don't have lawyers, you don't have jails, you don't have law books, you don't have anything. You don't want to kill anybody. You don't believe in killing people. You don't believe in capital punishment, but you have to have some order. It would be a good thing. When you hear that story, you think, well, maybe that's the best they could do under the circumstances. These are the things we should know about Africa. But the thing you should know about Mandela is this. He had perhaps the greatest capacity of anyone I have ever known to respond to debasing, even violent behavior with respect. Compare that to what is normal today, which is if someone criticizes you, you accuse them of doing what you've done. He had the capacity to deal with error he had made without denying them or attacking the people who pointed them out, but to respond to why he did what he did and let people make up their mind. He believed that if he ever dealt with people with something less than respect, he would undermine the ability of his country to live and work as one. I will always treasure those birthdays we shared, the talks we shared. I'm grateful that he defended me when I was under fire and admonished me not to be angry. I'm grateful that he reserved his anger for things that actually hurt other people. I'm grateful that he still believed till the last breath he took that in the end we could be reconciled. He himself took an African tribal approach to the horrible wrongs inflicted on his people with the Truth and Reconciliation Council. When he became president, he said, I don't want to put a lot of people in jail. I don't want to kill anybody. But I do want people to tell the truth, because the truth will set us free, and then we can go forward together. And we will decide what each person should do in their communities to atone for what is done before so that we can begin to live anew. America was always supposed to be a place about new beginnings. Until he died at 95, Mandela believed that the world was always full of people who were willing to make new beginnings. And the purpose of people like him was to make sure they had a chance to do it, not to block their way. Look at the art. Look at Mandela's life. Look at all the people who are trying to live by that in Africa today, especially young people. And I think you will leave these exhibits more hopeful than you entered them. Thank you very much.